Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're back into the Tamiya 1850l. We're going to be getting it to a rolling chassis. We'll start by having a look in bag E. We've got some metal brackets with some small fixings and another bracket with some rubber mud flaps. There's a load of bushings in this lot too, but those will of course get replaced with some proper bearings. In the other bag we've got some brass bits and the wheel nuts and some screws. The bulk of this part of the build involves mostly plastic parts, quite a lot of them scale parts like the rear lights. Right then, step 28, the battery box. We're going to need the large body clip, the 3x28mm metal shaft, and the hexagonal mount, which is a self-tapping screw with a bit on the top for the body clip to clip into. We're going to need two 2x8mm self-tappers, two 3x10 self-tappers, six 3x8 self-tappers, and then for plastic there's the D6 battery tray, D5 the strap, D1 the clamp, and D4 the end cap. There's also a couple of scale bits. We've got F6 for the air tanks and F10 for a fuel tank. There's also M5, which is an adapter for fitting the switch on the ESC. It's designed for a small slide switch though, so it's not going to work with the push button on the WP1080 that we're going to be fitting. First step then is to screw in the post for the body clip. It goes in easily enough with a cross wrench. We just need to make sure that it's just about bottomed out, then adjust it so the hole for the clip is along the long dimension of the tray. If it's not at the right angle, you're soon going to find out when you try fitting the clip. Next we have the strap. I always like this bit. It's such a simple design, but it works really well. We pop the metal shaft into the hole in the strap, and with the tray upside down, sit it in its cutout. Then the clamp goes over the top, and we just install two of the 3x8 self-tappers. When it's done up, the strap should flap around without any friction, and the hole should line up over the post that we just installed. Now if you've got the right angle, we can just pop in the body clip to keep it in position. At the other end we need to install the end cap. It just sits on the top and uses two 3x10 self-tappers. Unfortunately the end cap and the whole tray is designed for 9mm packs. Being Tamiya, it really does fit the old 6L 9mm pretty much perfectly. But most modern LiPo packs are square, which really doesn't work, and even the round LiPo packs are more often than not just slightly too big. If I remember correctly, Tamiya's new Volvo logging truck has a square tray. Now, it would be nice if Tamiya updated the older kits to match. Having said that, this truck has a huge load area built in, so finding somewhere for a high capacity LiPo shouldn't really be a problem. Next we're going to fit the air tanks. Now, there's a couple of stickers for gauges on the decal sheet, but I'm not going to bother fitting them, because you'll never see them, and to be honest, the half tanks don't really look all that good anyway. The tanks fit to the tray just above the end cap, and use two 3x8 self-tappers. At the other end of the tray we have the fuel tank, which again doesn't look great only being half a tank, and with the ESC mounted there too, it's really not all that scale. But we'll fit it as Tamiya intends, but in the future we'll end up changing all this out for something that looks a bit nicer. So that just leaves the two 2x8s, which would attach the slide switch mount, but as we don't need it, the screws can go in the unused parts pot just off the side of the camera. Step 29, fitting the tray to the chassis. This is a really simple one. We just need four M3x6s, the battery tray and the chassis. The instructions call for some thread lock on these, but in past builds I have found it near impossible to do without getting some on the plastic, causing it to go brittle around the screw heads. With the weight of the battery, they end up cracking after a couple of months. It's better just to leave them dry and keep an eye on them. All we need to do then is offer up the tray to the chassis and install the four screws. Couldn't be easier. Step 30, the rear bumper. For screws we need four 2x8 self-tappers and four 3x15 self-tappers. For plastic we have the M8 rear bumper, two S5s, the mounting plates for the light pods, two R3s, the light pods themselves, and remember I'm taking this truck to an event just a couple of days after filming, so I've given the insides of the pods a few coats of silver paint already so the light can reflect around inside. There's also two K3s, the rear lenses, which I've also painted the inside of. I just used Tamiya clear paints as the manual says. So the two pods attached to the mounting plates with the small screws, there's really nothing to it. Just make sure that you get a left and a right hand one, as the gap for the LED wiring should be on the inside. The lenses simply glue in place. There's no need to go silly with the glue, they're already a friction fit. All we need to do is put a couple of spots of poly cement inside the holes that the posts slot into. Then press the lenses in and they're ready to go. Build up the other side and we can attach them to the back of the bumper with the 3x15 self-tappers. Now it's also worth noting that all the holes for the screws are a little bit oversized, so if any of the bits end up at funny angles, don't worry, just slacken the screws off and adjust. There's more than enough movement to get them perfectly level with a little bit of fiddling. Step 31, the mud flaps. We're going to need the two metal brackets, the rubber mud flaps, 4 M2x5s and 2 R2s to clamp it all together. On the back of the R2s there's two big round bits that stick out and line up with the large holes in the mud flaps. Pop them in, then line it up with the M2 holes in one of the metal brackets. Install the two screws and it's done. Repeat with the other set of bits and just make sure that you end up with a left and a right hand assembly. Okay, step 32, fitting the bumper and the flaps to the chassis. This time we need the aluminium tube with the threaded holes in the ends, 2 M3x12s and 4 3x8 self-tappers. On the back of the chassis we've got two holes on each side for the metal brackets to mount to. The one towards the front are the M3 screws that go through the bracket, through the plastic bit on the chassis and then thread into the aluminium tube. For now, just do them up so we can still spin the brackets and install two of the self-tappers in the rearmost holes. Do up all four of the screws so there's still just a little bit of slack. When we get to the next step we'll need just a little bit of movement in them. Next is the bumper, which locates very nicely over the post right at the back of the chassis. It should be robust enough to take a few knocks without breaking. To attach it we just use the last two self-tappers. Looks quite neat, but I think replacing the two screws in the bumper with cap heads would look a little bit better. Those Phillips head screws, scaled up 14 times, would look a bit strange on a full-size truck. Step 33, the rear arches and box mount. We're going to need two of these brass widgets. They have a hex at one end and a tube that's threaded M3. Now Tamiya call them nuts, but I think that's pushing it a bit. We also need 4 M3x15s and 6 M3x6s. Also, hiding off at the top right corner of the diagram, it says we need 2 M3 flange nuts, but I didn't spot those right away. For plastic, all we need is a pair of S2s, the box mounts. We'll sort out the mounts first. Now on one side there's a hex shape that matches the hex on the brass bits. So all we need to do is press the brass bits in so the hex drops in. Quite a clever little part, and sure beats mounting the box with some self-tappers. The mounts mount with a pair of M3x6s on the top of the chassis rail. Very nice. The arches are almost as easy to fit. The first stage is to use two M3x15s from the inside of the arch and thread them into the side of the chassis. Don't do them up tight just yet, as there's another screw, one of the M3x6s. It goes through the metal bracket we fitted in the last step, and we use one of the M3 flange nuts on the inside. Once all the bits of the arch are together, go around and nip up all the screws, not forgetting the two that attach the brackets to the chassis. Spin the chassis round and repeat with the other side, and that's the back of the chassis more or less complete. And it does feel very sturdy, and nothing binds or collides. Great stuff. Step 34, more mounts, plates, and this time they're at the front. We need a solder terminal, another pair of elongated brass nuts, 2 flange nuts, a single M3x15, 2 3x8 self-tappers, and 11 M3x6s. For plastic bits there's an F3, the big plate that makes up the cab floor. There's also F7 that's supposed to mount the receiver, but I'm going to leave that out as there's so much space in the back of the truck it seems a bit silly to mount it up in the cab. We'll need another pair of S2 box mounts, an H1 the latch for the cab, and normally this would be white, but I've painted it matte black already just to save a bit of time. Right, there's a couple of bits we can get rid of right away. The solder terminal, the flange nut, and the M3x15 are there to mount a 27 or 40 meg antenna. We're going to be using 2.5 GHz, so we simply don't need it. Plus, cutting and soldering the old antenna never seemed like a brilliant idea in the first place. Starting at the front then, and we can offer the plate up to the chassis and line up the holes with the threaded holes in the top of the rails. There's 5 M3x6s to go in to keep it in place. And another little note, normally you would solder some leads to the motor first, as it's not so easy to get at otherwise, but as I'm filming this, the ESC hasn't arrived yet. Nip up the 5 screws and we can move on to the next bit. Just like the rear, the box mounts need the brass bits pressing in from the bottom and then get mounted to the chassis with more M3x6s. Lastly, just behind the big plate, we need to fit the latch with yet another pair of M3x6s. All quite nicely fitting bits. But the best thing is, because we've got that huge box on the back of the truck, we don't have to worry too much about trying to hide the receiver and the other electronics in the cab. We've got all the space we could ever need to make a scale interior, or even deck it out with a pan-tilt FPV setup. Right, the next couple of things are bits that we can't really do right now. We've got step 35 where they have us plug the battery in, but since we haven't got an ESC we can't really do that. Step 36 talks about setting up the gearbox. Again, no radio, so we can't really do it. Step 37 looks at the steering geometry, but no radio, so we can't really do the final setup. Which brings us to step 38, the wheels. Now the front wheels are no bother at all, it's just a case of pulling the tyre over the wheel. Tamiya want us to glue them too, but I've never really found it necessary. The only time I've had a tyre come loose was while transporting the trucks. Driving around, they've always been fine. The rear wheels also need the tyres pulling over the wheels. This time though we need to make up the dualies, which has a bit more to it. We need 6 M2x5 screws and 6 M2 plain nuts. For each pair there's an inside and an outside wheel. The inside one has the traditional 12mm hex drive and 3 hex holes for the M2 nuts. The outside wheel has 3 little nubs that locate on the outside of the inside wheel, aligning the holes for the screws. Now all we do is pop a nut in one of the hex holes, some tweezers really does help, then from the outside we can install a screw. As usual, don't do them up tight until all 3 are in, rinse and repeat with the other pair, and that's the wheels ready to fit. Step 39, fitting the front wheels. If we use the bushings, there's a few extra things to think about, but since we've got the 1150 bearings, it's really easy with no mess. We just need 4 bearings and 2 M4 flanged nylock nuts. All we do is press a bearing into each side of the front wheel, and make sure you press them in straight. Offer up a wheel to the stub on the axle, and thread on a nut. Generally, you should be able to bottom out the nut on the thread and still have the wheel freely spin. Sometimes though, they can end up being a little bit stiff or even completely locked up. All you need to do though is back the nut off just a little bit so it's not pinching the bearings. As long as it's spinning nicely, it's all good to go. Repeat on the other side and that's the front done. Step 40, fitting the rear wheels. This time, rather than bearings, we need 2 wheel hexes, and the last 2 M4 flanged nylock nuts. To fit the wheels, all we do is slide on a hex, and if it won't go on all the way, flip it over, because they do have a right way round. Pop a wheel assembly on, and fit the nut. Couldn't be much easier. When both are on, technically we've got a rolling chassis, and very nice it is too, but we're so close to finishing bag E now, I think we might as well continue. Step 41 then, the electronics tray and another fuel tank. We need 3 M3x15s, 4 M3x6s, there's M9, the big tray, and M3, the inside of the tank. The tray simply drops down on the top of the chassis and then gets the 4 M3x6 screws to hold it in. Usually this is for mounting the old Tamiya electronics to run the lights, but with more modern electronics we should easily be able to fit the radio, ESC and the light controller back here without having to deal with all the fuss of hiding it from the outside. The tank mounts up just behind where the ESC mount tank on the side of the chassis is, with the 3 M3x15s. This is a bit of a strange part as it's really designed to fit all the control knobs for the old Tamiya electronics. Now we don't have anything to fit inside, so we'll end up replacing it with something neater. For now though, we'll just fit it as Tamiya intends. Once all the screws are nipped up, we can move on to the next step. Step 42, and okay, that's fitting the Tamiya electronics. What we can pick out though is we need 4 2x8 self-tappers to mount the outside of the tank, and M2 is the outside of the tank itself. It just offers up to the bit we just fitted, and we install the 4 self-tappers. Now it doesn't look great with all the holes. There is a sticker to cover it up, but you're still left with a slot along the outside face. It's definitely somewhere where we can do better. Step 43 is yet more of the Tamiya electronics. It's amazing how complex the old setup was. There's screw terminals all over the place, not to mention the extra mechanical linkage to make it all work. Crazy stuff. So there we go then, one rolling chassis. The next step in the manual takes us on to bag F and the bodywork. So that's going to be it for this week. However, while filming, the postie dropped by with the ESC and the radio. We have a WP 1080, probably the best brushed ESC that doesn't cost silly money. You can set it up to work exceptionally well in pretty much every type of vehicle. For the radio, we have a GT3C. Now you might have already seen me modify it for 8 channels, but right now in this video it's fresh from the box with a stock firmware. To save a bit of time, I've done a very quick install. It's just using 2 channels, the steering and the throttle. The shift servo is sat unpowered, turned all the way into first gear position. It's literally just enough to get the truck running. When we start doing some more in-depth electronics, we'll have a closer look at what makes it go, but this will do for the time being. So that's it then for this week. A bit of a milestone in the build. So as always, thanks for watching. Like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a message if you got something to say. Bye guys!